Hi, welcome to Everlution.tv. My name is Dev Modi. I'm the host for today's session. And I'd like to introduce a guest, Ashok Gupta, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for a number of years in different guises. And I've been hugely impressed and inspired by the work he does. So when the opportunity came to have new guests on the show, I reached out to Ashok and asked him if he'd be willing to join us. And he said yes. So here he is. I'd like to just say a few words about Ashok in terms of his background. I'll be reading from his bio just to give us a sense of who he is. And I'm sure Ashok can fill in the gaps before we get into our conversation. So he's someone who's dedicated his life to improving people's well-being and helping them achieve their potential. He's been teaching meditation around the world for over 15 years. And I think I've seen some of your videos around the world, which look like you go to some very nice places. Personally, he has suffered from ME/CFS, which I'm sure you'll tell us more about, when he was studying at Cambridge University before completely curing himself of the condition. And that's led to a lifelong quest for him to help others recover from chronic and stress-related illnesses. After extensively studying brain neurology of illness, he's published several medical papers, and he's set up a global stress management clinic for over 15 years, specializing in the treatment of illnesses such as ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. You might have to correct me on the pronunciation there, and other associated conditions. So, Ashok, I hope I did you justice in terms of at least providing a mini introduction. If there's anything that I've missed, please fill in the gaps.
No, Dev, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for that lovely introduction. Now, I think you pretty much covered it. And obviously, there were more things that I can share in terms of what I've been up to. In addition, as we go along.
So, I guess my first question is really just tell us a little bit more about your story, because your bio alludes to, I guess, your personal journey in terms of how you've got to where you are today. And I know a lot of people watching this maybe haven't come across you before, so we'll find out more about what you're doing in the here and now. But just tell us a bit more about your history. Give us a sense of your roots and where you've come from.
Of course, yes. Wow, it's rare an opportunity one can just share one's life. So thank you for that. You know, I think like many of us, probably like yourself, we were an immigrant family who'd come to the UK. And, it's very interesting seeing at the time of filming this, the riots that are going on in America, the protests against what we're seeing. And, we also experienced that when we were growing up. There was division, there was racism, certainly where I was. So I didn't grow up in London. I grew up in Nottingham, which is a town about 120 miles north of London. So a small town. And certainly I think my first, I suppose, moment of self-awareness of what is self-development about, what is spirituality about, what are we seeing in the world around us, was when I experienced racism. And I wouldn't say it was really bad in those days, but it was certainly something that made you question your role in the world around you, whether you were a first-class citizen or a second-class citizen,
Right.
And I think that was my first kind of moment of awareness of, we're seen as different because of the color of our skin. Now, what does that mean? Why would someone treat you like that? And you ask those questions as kind of an innocent child. And I think that spurred me on to really try to understand, how could I make a difference in the lives of others? And I remember even as a child, even as a teenager, that was something that was quite a strong spark within me, to want to make a difference in some shape or form. And so I think that's really kind of where my journey started. And I was someone, as a result of being in an immigrant family, there was a lot of pressure to perform. I'd have aunties and uncles tell me, look, if you want to succeed in life, you're going to have to be twice as good as the nearest white guy.
Really?
So, you'd hear messages like that. And I don't know if it was so prevalent in London because there was such a large Indian population. But outside London, where I had very few Indian friends, most of my friends were white. Most of the people around me were white, which gave you this feeling that you had to work harder, you had to be better, you had to push yourself in order to succeed in a world where you weren't seen in the same way as your brothers and sisters.
Right. Yeah.
And it's only reflecting now that I look back on that and realize how formative that was in terms of my life experiences. And I'm sure, many people share that. And then obviously went to university, was someone who kind of pushed myself a lot at school and university. And then decided that actually I wanted to do the thing that we all do at university, which is push yourself too hard. So I was partying too hard, I was working too hard, I was trying to be the member of every different organization possible. Right. Yeah. And that's when I first got the condition you've mentioned, which is ME, sometimes known as chronic fatigue syndrome, right, which is a very debilitating illness. And it's essentially an illness where, although fatigue is often mentioned as one of the symptoms, really, I would describe it as your worst day of flu times 10.
Wow.
Right? So it's really a deep exhaustion. You have no energy. You find it difficult to function day to day. I remember sometimes I had to crawl to the bathroom because I just didn't have the energy. And suddenly here I am at university. I thought I had my life in front of me. And I hit this brick wall and doctors tell me, right, there's no cure to this. That's it. You've got this illness for life. We don't have any way of treating it. And we don't even know what causes it.
Right. Okay. That's pretty shocking at that age. And so which university were you studying at?
So I was studying at Cambridge University.
Undergrad then?
I was studying economics.
Right. So you were getting positioned for being a high flyer in terms of the world of finance, potentially banking. I don't know.
Exactly.
Making predictions here. That's what you're thinking. And I suppose this hits you. Doctors say they can't help you. I mean, I can't imagine what you would have been feeling at that point in your life. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, it was very challenging. And it was one of those moments which is quite surreal, where you question everything once again. So I think in my life, there have been certain things that have happened which have made me question myself. So at the time, it feels like an awful experience. Here's this illness. What are you supposed to do with that in your life? You may not be able to ever lead a normal life. But actually, now reflecting back, I can see how that was a gift to me at that time. So I soldiered on through university, even with having the illness. I managed to just about get my degree. And then I actually did a master's in London in international development, because I decided that international development was something that I wanted to do. But I still had the illness. And during that period of time, that's when I studied the brain neurology of illness, the brain neurology of emotion. So although my background wasn't in medical health specifically, I found that actually some of the models around economics, some of the circular models, some of the ways that we study economics are very applicable to the mind and brain neurology, because essentially a lot of economics is very psychological. And I managed to understand what was going on in my brain, what was causing this illness. And I then managed to retrain my brain. I mean, literally, that's the only way I can describe it. Retrain my brain out of this condition. Now, it's very clear that this isn't an emotional condition. This isn't a mental condition. This isn't a condition of the mind. It is a condition of the brain, where the brain goes into an altered state of overstimulating the nervous system and the immune system. But I managed to understand what was going on in my brain and retrain it. So I managed to get myself 100% better. And then I published a medical paper, a hypothesis on what I thought caused the condition.
Right. Okay.
Then after that period of time, I actually worked as a management consultant for a few years at PwC. And during that time, that's when I was formalizing further my theories and also working on setting up a clinic.
Right, okay.
So then I set up a clinic which dedicated itself to treating ME and chronic fatigue syndrome.
So how old were you when this was all going on, when you kind of found your own solution to your condition? What was your age?
So I was 21, 22, around that kind of age.
So at that age, not only did you find the solution yourself through, I guess, reading publications, maybe going on workshops, you can tell us a bit more about kind of what were the sources that gave you that inspiration and knowledge, or was it more introspection and self-awareness that gave you that wisdom? And then to do a medical journal at that age, it just sounds incredible that at that age you'd have that ability to do that and also hold down a job that's in a completely different field in management and consultancy. So just tell us a little bit more about what were the key influences that enabled you to solve this for yourself?
I would say that it's a thirst for learning. Yeah. I think from an early age, I've always had a thirst for learning, and I thank my parents for that, who pushed me to learn, to expand my mind, to always be questioning things.
Yeah.
And so at that particular age, I just wanted to know. It was just this feeling of, I want to understand what's going on in my brain, in my body, for a reason for myself, which is to heal myself, but also just the intellectual curiosity. And therefore, when you're in that space, you read everything that you can read. Anything you can get your hands on that seems to influence your understandings, you will go down that avenue. You will go down that path. And I think also the fact that I wasn't formally trained in medicine helped me, because I think when you get trained in a certain discipline, you can become blinkered sometimes about, this is the way that we think about medical conditions. And the medical profession very much is what I call an industry that looks at the hardware, whereas I was looking at the software. Not what's wrong with the hardware, but what's wrong with the software of our entire nervous system. How do we heal that? Right. And I think the key influences were, yes, that self-awareness of analyzing my mind, a deep introspection, but also reading self-development books, medical journals, medical books, and putting all of these disparate sources together. And I think that's something that often requires a combination of rationality and creativity.
Right. Okay.
That left brain and the right brain. That even when we're developing new hypotheses about things, or when scientists discover new ideas, it's often, they say, it kind of pops out of nowhere. It's that kind of, this idea that there is this space where all this knowledge sits. It already exists, and we are simply tapping into that knowledge. And that's what it felt like. It felt like a download of these particular ideas. It didn't feel like I was intelligent and the one working this out, but I was connecting to something bigger and grander than myself to find and understand this hypothesis.
So in terms of this concept of, you call it brain retrainment, is that what you refer to?
Brain retraining, yes.
Brain retraining. At that time, were you the first person to have come up with that concept? Like, you had not known of anyone else with that concept, or has it since then, have others come about who've got a similar idea? Like, what is brain retrainment in a sense, and does it draw upon any kind of established systems of knowledge or psychology at that time that you were tapping into and you kind of built on their shoulders, or it was really just from everywhere? It's very difficult to pinpoint a few particular sources.
I think it was a combination of sources, absolutely. And although the concepts of brain retraining were in their infancy during that period of time, certainly there were people looking at this area. But when I came up with the way of doing it, I did it in a bubble. I was retraining my brain in isolation without necessarily understanding other people that had done a similar thing. But I was building on these kind of core concepts around psychology. And when I came up with the different ways of doing it, it was an experiment. And it was only when I set up my clinic and started working with other clients, I realized that those processes needed refining, because what works for one person doesn't always work for somebody else. So there was many years of refinement of saying, right, we just need to adjust this, make sure this happens, then we get the best results with our clients. Wow. So it's always been a work in progress to get it right. And then in 2007, I actually published an online study course called the Gupta Program, which formalized these processes, because there was only a certain number of people I could see in my clinic. And I wanted to kind of get this out in the world. So that's when I first published the Gupta Program online, which was a video course on DVD at that particular time. We can remember the good old days of DVDs. and that gave the opportunity for many people around the world to benefit from this brain retraining and this knowledge.
Right. So the Gupta Program essentially codified things that you were doing in the clinic so that you could share it on a wider scale. And so that has continued since 2007 till today. If people want to learn about it, do it, they can find out about that program. And can you give us any kind of insights in a summary? What is brain retrainment or brain retraining? How do you summarize what it really is to someone like me or a layperson?
Let's think of something where we're retraining our brain. And a classic example is learning to drive a car. right? So you sit in the car, and the first day of your lesson, your brain is not trained to be able to drive that car. So we do something which is the conscious training initially, which is we learn how to move the steering wheel, press the accelerator, the gear shift, everything. And we are learning, we're training our brain to do something new. Yeah. Then eventually, after 10 to 15 lessons, or in some cases, some people have 25, 30 lessons, and many driving tests later, we can safely say that, right, we have now trained our brain to drive a car.
Yeah.
Right. And we can be driving a car, eating a sandwich, making a phone call. Not that I say that's a good thing to do, but those are things that people are able to do because we've now become what we call unconsciously competent.
Yeah.
So initially we had to become consciously competent, and then our brain got trained to become unconsciously competent, which means that we are in an automatic way of responding. Now, in the case of illness, what happens is we are exposed to so many different viruses and bacterial infections all the time, and our bodies fight these off. But imagine if you're extremely stressed and extremely maybe chronic stress, acute stress, we can't fight off that virus effectively. So the brain and the body go into this hyperreactive mode, this emergency mode. So that even once that initial flu or cold has gone, the brain has been trained to hyperreact to any virus, any bacteria, or even any semblance of the experience from the first illness.
Right. Okay.
The purpose of brain retraining is to say, right, now that our body is in this state, we need to detrain it from that state and retrain it into a new state. And if you look at many of the mental, emotional challenges that people face in life, whether it's anxiety or addictions, ultimately the brain has settled into a new state of being based on the training that it's gone through. So our brains are essentially trained according to our influences, our decisions, our experiences. And that training is not our destiny. Once we're adults and we're more conscious than perhaps we were as children, we have the opportunity to retrain the brain into a new state of being. And just like we've learned to drive the car. So in the same way, the brain retraining is using a unique set of processes that allow the brain to train itself on a new path. And the example would be, let's say, if rain is falling on a mountain, the rain falls onto the mountain, which kind of represents our thought energy, and creates grooves down the side of the mountain. So the water flows down the side of the mountain. So one of those grooves has been formed through that repetitive energy, going through it again and again and again. So it's dug a really deep river along the side of the mountain. But that's your traditional way of thinking and your beliefs and your way of being. And so now we're diverting that water. So sometimes after many thousands of years, even millions of years, a river can be diverted along a new path. And in the same way, as soon as we become aware of an experience which represents an old way of being, if we shift and do something new to a new way of being, we dig a new path, a new groove.
Right.
Until eventually all that thought energy goes along the new groove. And so we are retraining our brain. And not only is this demonstrated in a psychological sense, but it's been demonstrated in a neurological sense as well, where we're actually getting neurons rewiring continuously. And this is under the banner of neuroplasticity.
Right.
Our brains are not our destiny. Our genes are not our destiny. Our backgrounds are not our destiny. We have more free will and more control than we realize if we invest in ourselves, in our minds, in our self-care. So I think that would be how I would describe brain retraining.
Fantastic. I love the analogy of the rain on the mountain and the rivers, because I can just visualize in my head. I had a picture of the Himalayas and the rivers coming down, and how over time they can fork out into different ways, and actually how the brain is very similar. So I love that analogy. The question I had in my mind was, how similar or different is the process that you use with your clients and then also on these online programs to, say, visualization techniques, meditation, mindfulness? I guess there's lots of guided meditation apps now where you kind of close your eyes and they've got different kinds of sounds going into different ears and all sorts of stuff going on, which I've heard is also kind of an emerging area in the mindfulness space. So I just wanted to get a sense of do you draw upon these other disciplines, or would you say yours is quite distinctive?
I would say it's very distinctive, very different. So, of course, there are small aspects of mindfulness within our program, and we incorporate that. But the fundamental brain retraining is awareness of those unconscious patterns, certainly when a person has illness, recognizing that. And it's a combination of there is a breath technique within it. There is what we call self-coaching. So there's an area of therapy called parts therapy, where you're actually speaking and communicating to unconscious parts of yourself.
Yeah.
Then there is certainly visualization within it. And a lot of this is done standing up. So you're actually moving, you're literally mapping out your brain and moving physically between different pathways in the brain.
Wow.
To create a visual representation, which is much more powerful for brain retraining than simply using your mind. As an example, if you're learning to drive a car, you could sit there on the first lesson of the car and say, right, I'm going to visualize, I'm just going to move the gear stick, and I'm going to move the steering wheel. And if I'm really positive and I have a positive mindset and a calm mindset, I'll be able to drive this car.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily going to help. Actually, it's the physical doing of that process repeatedly again and again and again, which retrains the brain much quicker and much more powerfully.
Right. So it really does sound like a real integration of so many different disciplines. It's created its own kind of discipline because it's drawn on so many others. There's no one thing that would be comparable, it sounds like, to what you've produced. And I think the other interesting part is it's so focused on these specific conditions. You mentioned a few other conditions in the biography. Could you just tell us a little bit more about these other conditions? Are they all kind of connected to each other? They're kind of similar in symptoms? If someone's listening to this, what should they be really thinking about if they are feeling maybe tired or fatigued, especially with lockdown, given the time when we're doing this interview? I was just speaking to someone yesterday, actually, a senior leader at EY, and he was saying how he sits from morning till night at his desk, on Zoom calls, on the telephone, because people are sharing documents, he can't move around and walk and talk. So he's pretty much just chained to the desk. And he's ended up getting some kind of issues with his circulation, especially in his legs. And he's gone to see the doctor and all sorts of stuff. And it's kind of made him quite worried, actually, and anxious about his health now. And I'm sure there's lots of other people in the same boat as him, who are simply in a new pattern of working, a new way of living, lots of different pressures and stresses, as well as also, I guess, work insecurities, health insecurities. I think the COVID crisis has brought upon a lot of people multiple different crises, which independently on their own, I think people would have a certain level of resilience to deal with it. But the combination right now is quite extraordinary. So I'm just keen to understand, what have you seen with your clients? Have you seen a real spike in demand for your work? What kinds of issues are people coming to you with?
Well, so the first point about the way people are living right now, even before COVID-19, if I just address that and then we'll look at COVID. Yeah. We're not living according to our evolutionary inheritance. Yeah. So for thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, we were often hunter-gatherers or farmers, working outdoors, being in touch with nature, being in communion with nature. Suddenly, in the last couple of hundred years, we decide to build boxes, which we spend 90% of our time inside, sitting on a chair, staring at a screen, and somehow think that our body isn't going to react to that. When it's not trained to be like that. So we're sitting at home, we aren't moving or exercising anything like we used to during our past. Yeah. We're eating foods which have had all kinds of additives added to them and haven't been produced in an organic way. We're not sleeping the hours that we should do according to the rhythms of nature. Right. All of these things make an impact on our system and create what we call an inflammatory bias. So it means that our bodies and our brains are constantly more inflamed than they need to be. And it's a mild immune reaction that's occurring, which is why in the modern workplace, we see a lot of fatigue, we see a lack of circulation, we see a lot of these unknown conditions which doctors can't really do anything about. Yeah. Wow. And pain and fatigue are two of the top things that people go to see a doctor for, and yet the doctor can't really do anything about those two two aspects of our living. Yeah. And if you fast forward to now COVID, that's magnified some of those things, which is that we now have elevated stress levels because everyone's worried about catching the virus, or they're worried about their job security or their finances. So there's an underlying sense of dread or fear that many people are experiencing, coupled with exactly what you've said, that people are spending far more time in front of a screen than they used to. They're having far less interaction with other people. Now, for some people, they actually feel better in lockdown, but for many people, they feel worse in lockdown. And it depends on each individual's situation. But certainly, once again, it's a magnification of us not living according to our evolutionary nature, which is to be around people, to be in nature, to be in daylight, and not be huddled over a screen in a stress response, And, obviously at the moment, hopefully this is a temporary situation. I'm sure it is, and therefore things will ease. But even once we come out of lockdown, this is a wake-up call for humanity to say, do we want to continue living the way that we've been living? Is it good for us as a species to continue this kind of, we've fallen into, it's an accidental way of living. It's not something that's been by design. And now when we think about it consciously, what can we change and what can we do differently? And we're certainly seeing far more people experiencing anxiety, grief, depression, coming to our clinic and looking for answers and solutions.
I mean, it's just fantastic hearing what you're talking about. There's just so much I want to ask you, because you covered a lot in that piece. So many different angles. So let me think about it. One thing I was laughing about to myself is, as you were saying, about being hunched over a laptop in a box, and here I am in a box, hunched over my laptop doing a Zoom call. But I do think what you said is right. Is that even before COVID, life hasn't been designed by consciously. So we are living in a world where people are suffering by the nature of the design of the lifestyles that they have, that have been almost unconsciously being created, essentially. There are some people I know who actually have found lockdown to be really useful because they've ended up doing more exercise, they've been going outdoors more, because they've made the effort to create that space in their diary to make it possible. They've spent more time with family, the dog, whatever it is. So, there are people who have found that. And then on the flip side, you've got people in a very different life situation, suffering isolation. They really crave connection and they can't get it. They have job insecurity, so they're working longer hours to make up for it, and longer hours also sitting in the same position, whereas naturally in the office there was a certain level of movement going on. But I have spoken to friends who have said that the air is cleaner, they can hear the birds singing, and they found they've reconnected with nature. So I think there is definitely upsides and downsides, and I'd like to just zone in a little bit on, like you talked about how we live in this world that hasn't been designed consciously. And whenever I speak to anyone or I watch videos myself where people say this, I say, okay, we know that something is not working right now, but what is the alternative? What options do we have in terms of designing our lives, especially when people have financial pressure, so they might not have the luxury to live in a different way or in a different environment. So what kinds of conversations are you having with people around that?
We can separate this into three areas. So it's a transformation at the individual individual level. So the humanities wake-up call is at the individual level, who do we choose to be? At a community level and a society level, who do we choose to be? At a global level, who do we choose to be? And when I say that these systems have been designed accidentally, what's happened is that often war, so for instance, the Second World War caused a shift and a transformation in the way the world organized itself. There was a level of conscious awareness after that. So I'm not saying it's all been kind of bad. But then the way that technology, the waves of technology that have come over the last 100 years, the way that's transformed our lives, the way financial systems have occurred and how they've transformed our lives. There's an element of it being unconscious. And a classic example of this would be the way that we use social media. Yeah. Social media has arrived, and we as adults at least have the luxury of having a level of awareness or consciousness around it. Whereas actually I truly believe that social media has been detrimental to teenagers, to young people and teenagers. For instance, we now see levels of anxiety, depression, self-harm, anorexia, and other eating disorders massively increasing, to the point at which a third of teenage girls now suffer from an eating disorder.
Wow, that is scary.
Isn't that like shocking? Yeah. So it's an example of where something has come along that we thought is something we naturally embrace, but it's come along in an unconscious way, which has then caused challenges in the world. In the same way, it's all about our cultural story. So what is that cultural story that we used to live before? Survival of the fittest. Yeah. So it really is, well, okay, you've got to get to school, you've got to work hard, you've got to prove yourself, get the best grades, get the best job. You're all competing amongst each other. Then you'll be able to get that job you've always wanted, earn the money that you've always wanted, get the car and get the house and impress all your peers around you. That's the cultural story. And that cultural story is embedded within media, within the stories and the myths of life that we live. So that's one example of a unconscious value that embeds itself in society.
Yeah.
Another cultural story will be there is superiority and inferiority. So what we're seeing in America right now and the protests against what's happened, there is embedded unconsciously within us a sense of someone is better than someone else if they're richer or poorer. Somebody is better than someone else if they're more successful or more beautiful. Someone's better or worse than us if they have more power. Or if they're of a certain color. So the politics and sociology of separation, divisiveness, better, worse, is a cultural story which is once again embedded unconsciously within us all. And all of us make these judgments, whether we're consciously aware of them or not. That's another idea of an old cultural story. And so these myths of insufficiency, there's not enough to go around. Yeah. So all of us have to run around to make sure we can get enough of that stuff that we don't have. That's another cultural story. So, we mentioned the survival of the fittest. Another cultural story can be that somehow, if we don't pray to the right God in the right way, we're going to suffer for eternity.
Yeah.
Again, another cultural narrative which comes from certain religions, certain exclusivist religions. Once again, gets embedded into our system unconsciously, and even people who aren't followers of those religions will still have that unconscious bias. Yeah. So when we identify so many of these cultural myths which are embedded in society, then we can start saying what is working for us and what is not working for us. Yeah. Let's set a destination of where we choose to go. And when I ask this question, actually many people answer it in a very similar way, which is we want a society where everyone can have that sense of freedom and independence to choose how they want to express themselves. I won't go too much into that, but there's a way we can design life that many people would agree with. Yeah. And then we say, let's look at our cultural myths and our cultural stories. And let's say which ones are working for us that will take us into that destination and which ones aren't working for us. And what do we need to transform and change? And for me, one of the answers, I'm not saying it's the answer because it's a work in progress, but one of the answers is to live according to our human values. So if we say, right, what do we share as human beings? Well, we share the idea that love is supreme. And whether you ask an atheist or a religionist or whoever, the idea that love is that moves the world, love is the most powerful force in nature, is something that we can all agree on. Yeah. That compassion and care for those around us is an incredibly important part of who we choose to be as human beings. Yeah. The idea of our ability to make ourselves happy and make other people happy is an important part of that no one should suffer. So when we start celebrating what are our shared human values, our shared ways of organizing ourselves, then we can say, how can we take these shared values and embed them into the systems around us? Is a financial system that says survival of the fittest, and if you don't make it, you will suffer and you won't even have access to basic needs, is that a kind of system that reflects those human values? And how do we redesign that? Yeah.
So this whole concept of culture, I'm so glad that you've brought it up, because I think the concept of culture works on so many different levels. So, I love the levels that you talked about, the individual, the community, and the global level. And I guess the cultural myths work at the same level. levels as well. And in terms of the UK, maybe in terms of the globe, what are some of the I guess the values that we all hold and share and hold dear and close to our hearts? We need to realign with those. It seems like we as a society, we're saying one thing about our values, but actually our habits and our choices are not lining up with our values, essentially. And it's very difficult to resist. Now, you talk about social media. It's very difficult on a practical level for, say, a mum and dad who've got teenagers to restrict them from using social media, because even if they don't give them a smartphone, they'll end up getting one from somewhere else or using their friend's smartphone. And I've got uncles and aunties who are in their 70s who I used to be able to have really great conversations with them, but now they're glued to WhatsApp when I'm in front of them, which is bizarre, really, because they're in their 70s, but they use WhatsApp more than I do, and they do a lot of WhatsApp spamming as well, which I tell them off about. So the thing is, this seems to kind of transcend generational differences, because I think when the PC came out, it was the case that you could get away with not knowing how to use a PC and still be functional in society. I think we're at a stage now where if you don't use a smartphone, you will be excluded from certain elements of society and access to certain types of services, for example. So it's become kind of integrated into who we are without us necessarily challenging the way we're using it and the damage it might be doing to not just us, but especially kids who have grown up with this technology and they know nothing else. That's all they've ever known is Instagram, the Instagram generation or the WhatsApp generation. So I think on the one hand, you've got this whole technology-driven world that we live in. On the other hand, you talk about nature and actually being connected to nature. It seems like these two things should be helping each other. Like they should be intertwined somehow, because none of them are going to go away. We're not going to get rid of technology, and we can't live without nature. You know, we live on Mother Earth and we depend on Mother Earth's resources. At the same time, we've got this drive to continually improve everything about us. So how do you kind of see these two things integrating? You know, what should we as leaders, as community members, be saying yes and no to, or changing in our beliefs to help us, I guess, design this new way of life? What are the kind of critical lessons that we need to take away?
We use the technology, we don't abuse the technology.
Right.
Yeah. It's realizing that the nature of us as individuals is to become addicted to something. Yeah. So it's as a starting point, from a neurological perspective, our brains are addictive machines. Yeah. I mean, let me qualify that. Okay. We have this brain chemical called dopamine. Mm-hmm. And dopamine is a reward chemical. And dopamine gets triggered if we do something that the brain or the body feels is positive for survival or positive as an experience. So we have a big slice of chocolate cake in front of us, right? We eat that chocolate cake, delicious. The dopamine starts firing off. Now, we can see a second slice of chocolate cake in front of us. Yeah, the brain, or certainly part of the brain, will say, give me that second slice of chocolate cake. It's going to feel so good, right? But another part of our brain will say, hang on a minute, if I have that second slice, although I'll have a short-term feeling of feeling great, actually I'll feel sluggish and yucky, and it's not great for my diet, it's not great for my health, etc. So hopefully we would resist taking that second slice of chocolate cake.
Right.
When it comes to social media, our use of screens, we are still using them unconsciously because of their addictive nature. So it's the analogy of we're reaching for that second slice of chocolate cake continually with our use of screens. And we're screening ourselves out and we're screening other people out.
Right.
We're literally screening people out.
Well, that analogy of the chocolate cake, whereas an actual physical chocolate cake, there is a limited supply of chocolate cake. Mm-hmm. Potentially within your house. You'd have to go and buy another one if you ate it all. With technology, there is an unlimited supply of digital content. And I guess that's where the addictive power of technology then goes into another level of, I guess, influence, because it's always with you. Whereas a chocolate cake, you've got to make some effort to go and buy it, and then it's in your fridge, and then it goes off. And there's a certain kind of, there's constraints around how addicted you could get to that, potentially. But with a phone, it's not just the fact that it's with you all the time, it's with everybody else all the time as well. So it's almost become a shared culture that we have. And you talk about this sense of like we live in a world that's kind of designed to create stress, create that inflammatory response. The number of people I talk to in the corporate arena, not just in the leadership development space and health and well-being space, who themselves are feeling quite stressed out, but the people that we're trying to help are also feeling stressed out, and they're very, very successful people, materially, financially, incredibly successful. They really don't have anything to worry about from a financial point of view. Yet, there isn't a sense of vibrancy, happiness, joy, excitement, or you could say even love about the way in which they engage with life, the way in which they engage with their employees, their teams, and their families, because they're under that sense of comparison, competition, and all of those types of things that you've talked about around survival. So it's really, really interesting analogy.
And just to add to that, once again, it's about making a shift on the inside and a shift on the outside. So any change always involves, in my view, those two aspects.
Right.
So a shift on the inside is saying, now that we have the research that shows that the longer we're on a screen, the worse we feel mentally, emotionally, physically. Yeah. But we know that if we, for instance, restrict teenagers or certainly young children to an hour a day on a screen or an hour and a half on a day, we know that the negative effects don't necessarily manifest themselves. Yeah. Now, if you told a teenager to only use social media for, like, say, 2 hours a day, they'll think you're crazy. But, once again, as adults, as parents, it's our responsibility to look at this research and understand it and understand how dangerous these devices actually are. So the change from the inside is, how can I become more consciously aware of what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and make a shift that's positive for my health? So that's why I say that human beings were operating unconsciously with unconscious narratives, unconscious systems, and that's what's causing the spikes in anxiety and depression and lack of satisfaction in life. So we become more conscious internally and take responsibility for our screen time. Externally, the shifts we make are actually, how do we set up routines that mean that we're able to overcome the addictive quality of screens or anything in life? So as an example, if someone's engaging in weight loss, what they will be told is, don't go and buy these things in the first place to put into your household because they'll be too tempting. Or make sure that your partner makes you accountable for not having those things that you don't want to eat. Okay. So in the same way, we set up routines. So someone who's that stressed out executive that feels they've got too much screen time and they're feeling overwhelmed, ultimately, by taking responsibility for that, internally they can change it, but also putting the systems in place. So they say, okay, I'm going to wake up in the morning. I'm going to meditate, right? I'm going to walk in nature in the mornings. Then I'm going to switch on my screens and laptops, but only at 9 o'clock and not before that. Yeah. I'm going to tell my teams that actually we're going to limit the amount of time that we spend in meetings so that we're not having 1 hour long meetings or 2 hour long meetings for the sake of it. And as you know, I also teach time management and meeting skills as well. So there's a lot of wasted time there. And then actually, whatever it is, 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, I'm going to decide that that is my shut off point no matter what. And I'm going to meditate once again to go inwards, to get myself away from the screen. Then in the evenings, I'm going to do activities which don't involve screens so that my screen time is limited to the daytime. So these are all systems and plans that we put in place at an external level to make sure that we're not overdoing it. And just to say what is unconscious within us, we all have an achiever within us. It's that kind of achiever state of mind. And that achiever says, do more, be more, you're not good enough. There's insufficiency, insecurity within you. There's a gap that you need to fill by proving how brilliant you are, proving that you're going to do the longer hours, you're going to sacrifice yourself for the company. So when we're doing things, we'll tell ourselves, oh, but I have to do that. I have to work those 12-hour days. It's absolutely imperative. And the people around us and the company and our own insecurities will feed and fuel that belief system. But actually, when we take a step back and realize we created the drama inside of ourselves, we can take responsibility for monitoring our number of hours that we work. And we know that companies have a responsibility also to make sure that we're not becoming too stressed or working beyond our limits. And in that way, these internal shifts and external shifts become a powerful, I suppose, catalyst for change in people's lives. But it does require both, in my experience.
So, Ashok, you mentioned some great practical tips as an individual that we can take on board and design our lives in a much better way. But kind of going back to some of the stuff you said earlier on around these cultural myths that we have and belief systems that are unconscious in the environment, really, that we've grown up in from a cultural, societal point of view. Do you think that there's something inherently dysfunctional with society right now in terms of these underlying beliefs that we have about what life is about and the meaning of why we're here? And actually, there's only so much an individual can do, but actually there needs to be something that's far more systemic in the world around us to really enable people to come into that state of fulfillment and vibrancy and really step into their power of being the best they can be, physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually.
We've been here before. Yeah, we do it time and time again in the sense of, let's take an example of slavery, right? These systems are integrated into our society and we all think they're normal. And then suddenly someone comes along and says, like William Wilberforce, and says, hang on, is this right? Is slavery really what we want to do? Does it really reflect our human values? Does it really reflect who we are? So let's think about this. A few hundred years ago, having slaves in your household, treating them badly, was a perfectly normal and Christian thing to do in America, in Europe. Yeah, no one questioned it. Of course, that's absolutely fine, and it fits with what's said in the Bible. No one questioned it. Then a small group of people came along and said,
just 1 second, just because my wife is just walking out, and given we're talking about walking, I just want to make sure I know where they're going so I can find them. In 1 sec. Andy, where are you guys going? Oh, can you just give me 10 minutes? Just give me 10 minutes. Just come back. Just give 10 minutes. Yeah. Hello? Oh, I've lost you.
Oh no, I'm back.
You can see I'm trying to take on board your practical tips immediately by making sure I actually get some downtime and I can go for a walk with the family. No time like the present to put it into
practice. Yeah, absolutely.
So, so I'm just wondering, I cut you up there. You were talking about slavery and actually the systems. If you just don't mind continuing where I cut you off.
Of course, absolutely. So I was saying that you were talking about these cultural myths and how we change them, and how is this possible? Where do we start from? It's only taken a small band of people to wake up society. So I give that once again the example. So the example of slavery is that it was a perfectly normal and Christian thing to do, to have slaves in your household, to treat them badly, to hit them. In America, Europe, that was over the space of hundreds of years. And then suddenly people came along and said, hang on, is this right? Does this fit with our values in the Bible? Does it fit with our human values? Maybe this is something we should question. But until then, no one questioned it. Right. So in the same way, we can have hope for humanity, that actually things that and systems that we think can't change, won't change because no one's going to do it. Actually, it only takes 1 or 2% of the population to wake up the other 98%, when their force for good and their belief in what they believe in is powerful, and they move forward with that grace. So in the same way, what we're seeing in America right now is a movement that says, and it's always been there, it's been there for many years, many decades, it is not right that people in our country are treated differently according to their color. But that doesn't just come down to police brutality. That comes down to the way that the education and school system exists in America. That also comes down to the healthcare system and healthcare provision. If you're a black person in America, you're 2 or 3 times more likely to die from a serious condition. Yeah, this is the health inequality which exists, the education inequality. You're less likely to get a good education if you live in America, if you're black. So that kind of cultural story where it's okay to have a privatized a privatized healthcare system where 50 million people don't have access to healthcare. Those kinds of cultural stories and cultural myths is what people are challenging and looking to bring about change. So I'm very hopeful for humanity that actually it's only when things get really bad do we then wake up. So we need to, and many spiritual stories talk about this, it's only when we hit the depths, sometimes called the dark night of the soul. It's only when we hit the bottom, rock bottom, even if you're an addict, that suddenly change is initiated. And in our society right now, the change that we're going to see, I believe, the next 5 years even, is going to be fantastic and amazing. Yeah, and it's not going to be completed in the next 5 or 10 years, but that spirit of change we can feel is all around us. And the pandemic, the things that we see globally are now driving that change. And it's about bringing those different communities together. So at the moment, we've got these disparate, whether they be think tanks or organizations and sets of people who all have that common feeling of we want to change the world, we want to transform the way we live, but they are separated. Whereas what we're trying to do here at some of the things we're doing here at the clinic is to bring those disparate groups together and create a united front of people who want to see that transformation. So funny enough, at the moment, we're just launching a new summit and kind of retreat, which is called Humanity's Wake Up Call. Wow. That this pandemic is humanity's wake-up call. How can we bring these different groups together? And we'll have some speakers and people talking about these different subjects.
Fantastic. I think you've done two things that are really important for anyone watching this. Is you provided a really optimistic vision. I think hope is needed. When times are dark and tough, that's when we need people like you, Ashok, to kind of wake us up and give us an optimistic view of humanity and the way forward. And I think the other thing that you've done for me and others is actually you've laid down a challenge for us, for all of us, and I'm sure including for yourself, that actually it's up to us that when these atrocities, tragedies, prejudices are existing in the world around us, not just for people in our own community, but people in any community, that it's all of us standing together. And we can't be successful as a race, the human race, if there are elements of our community, and maybe I'll go beyond human race, and I'll bring in the animals and the environment as well, because I think we can't be successful as life on this planet if we don't consider all other life on this planet, whether that I is thinking of I'm an Indian, I'm a black person, I'm a European, or what if I'm part of the human race? It's like we need to think differently about the way we're engaging with the world around us. So I think that's what I'm taking away from this: optimism and a sense of challenge as well, in terms of what am I going to do about this. Now, I know we need to close off. Unfortunately, I wish I could listen to you for hours because you have so much to share.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Definitely, I'm going to see if I can influence you to do another session like this in the coming months. But just for now, I know you've dropped a few hints about how people can get in touch with you. We're going to leave your description, your bio, and your links in the page below the video so that people can find you. But is there anything immediate in the next kind of couple of weeks, months that people need to think about in terms of getting in touch with you? You've got this retreat. What is the best way for people to contact Ashok Gupta?
Okay, so there's several different ways. So the first thing is if someone's suffering from anxiety or chronic illness, we have the Gupta Program, which is the brain retraining program. So that's at guptaprogram.com. Okay. And we also have a free app, which we obviously can get a chance to talk about. But I have a free app, which is a meditation app, but a whole program of self-development and spiritual self-awareness, and also discovering your life purpose. So it's a whole program, a 30-day program, which is a not-for-profit. So that's, people can see it, themeaningoflife.tv, and it's called the Meaning of Life Experiment. And then if people are concerned about the coronavirus and they want to boost their immune system, which is something that we can do right now, we have a free not-for-profit course, a 10-day program on how people can boost their immune system at thecoronaviruschallenge.com.
Right, great.
So that's another thing that we've provided very quickly, just to give people that boost in terms of what they can do for themselves. And then in terms of Humanity's Wake Up Call, that's a big summit and retreat that we are launching, which will happen in July 2020. And that is at humanitieswakeupcall.com.
Wow. You are a man on a mission, I can tell, just given what you've shared in the last 2 minutes in terms of what you're doing. I mean, it's amazing. It's so inspiring to hear and see what you're up to, how you're really making a difference. You've definitely taken on board your knowledge, your wisdom, and you're applying it in terms of sharing it with the world. And the amount of things that you're giving away for free as well is awesome. So many people out there, a lot of sharks. When the economy goes down, the scammers come out, and a lot of people out there trying to sell stuff low quality for high prices, and here you are giving away top quality for free for people to benefit their lives. So I'm definitely going to be checking out a lot more of your content. I hope others will too. And yeah, thank you for your time, Ashok. I'm really looking forward to staying close to your developments in terms of your work and your voluntary work as well. And hopefully we'll have you on Everlution.tv again in the near future, because there's clearly a lot for us to talk about still.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful to be on your show, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. And something I just wanted to leave your viewers and your listeners with is just this idea of unity, and that ultimately the hope comes because we are unified, not just in a conceptual sense, but actually in a physical sense, in a spiritual sense. We're all one being. We're all there. That oneness exists. So all we need to do is reflect that existing oneness in the way that we treat ourselves, that we treat other people, and that we organize as a society. So there's nothing we have to create. We simply need to reflect who we already are.
Beautiful, beautiful message to end this on. Thank you very much, Ashok. Good luck with all of your projects, and I look forward to seeing you face to face in the flesh and blood at some point. But until then, I'll be happy with virtual.
Great. Yeah, lovely. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.